Now, we've got a situation at the Bundy Ranch. Now, we've been telling you about this. We have the ranch owner who has been having his cows, his cattle, graze on federal land for over 2 decades now. He's supposed to pay a fee for that. Now he's owes more than $1 million to the federal government. He refused to pay for it. He says, look, my ancestors have been on this land since the 1880s, and hence I will not pay any fees to the federal government. I don't recognize their authority, and I'm going to allow my cattle to graze there. He might have a surprisingly decent point. Hang in to the end of the story to find that twist out, okay, and why that's the case. Now, I have a concern with this way of operating, because then the Native Americans, for example, could come and say, I don't recognize federal authority, and trust me that my ancestors have been on this land much longer. And I'd like to show up with weapons and tell federal officials that I might use them and hence get my way, as some of the militia that seem to support Mr. Bundy did. And that would be problematic. Or you could have many other people show up with weapons and say, well, I wouldn't like to pay my taxes or fees to the government either. I don't think it's the right way to approach things. Now, as we discussed that yesterday on the show, a lot of people did not like that point of view, including a lot of our audience. And they all kept pointing me to one video, and it was put together by Storm Clouds Gathering to point out what the real story behind this federal grabbing of Mr. Bundy's cattle, as it were, right? And what was the real motivation. And they actually put together a really interesting story, and one that I was open to. It talked about how Harry Reid's son, Rory Reid, was in charge of getting a deal for this company called ENN Energy Group out of China. Now, the value of that deal was $5 billion, and the land that they got was in the general area there and had actually been sold at way below market value. Now, look, I've seen this game 100 times where the politically connected and sometimes literally the family members of senators and congressmen get these great deals. Now, he's working for that Chinese group, so I was open to that suggestion. And then they also explained that the guy who's in charge of the Bureau of Land Management and ultimately made these decisions, the guy we quoted yesterday, Neil Corns, was actually a former staffer of Harry Reid. Fascinating. And they're saying that this energy company of China was going to build solar energy right on the land where Mr. Bundy's cattle was grazing. And in fact, they claim to have found an old part of the website involved in this portion of the land, and Nevada is dealing with it and the federal government's dealing with it, that explained that non-governmental organizations have expressed concern that there's a regional mitigation strategy that affects the solar companies, and that it involves the trespass of cattle. Okay, so look, I heard it out and I thought it was interesting. So what did I do? I looked further, of course. I wanted to see, well, is it true? Was Harry Reid's son involved in that? Yes, he was. Did Harry Reid have a former staffer who's now the head of the Bureau of Land Management? Yes, that's also true. Now, is it true that they did this and kicked out Mr. Bundy's poor cattle from this place, or they want to kick it out? Obviously, they weren't able to. In fact, the federal government had to return that 400 cows to Mr. Bundy because they showed up with guns, the Bundy clan did. So now, let's find out what the reality is. First of all, let's go back and find out how all this started. And the place that I turned here was Snopes. And they had all the links, and I went to all the original source articles as well. So first they explained, look, back in 1993, Cliven Bundy began declining to pay the government's fees required to allow his cattle to graze on public lands. And in 1998, as a part of an effort to protect the endangered desert tortoise found in that area, the government obtained the issuance of a court order requiring Bundy to take his cows off that land. Now, back in 1993 and 1998, there was no Chinese solar deal, so if they were setting this up, boy, did they play a long game, right? Now, second of all, as you see there, there's the endangered tortoise, right? Now, a lot of people are dismissive of the endangered tortoise. That's not what this is about. It's about a business deal. Hey, you look, I might be open to that. That might be interesting, right? But they didn't plan it out back in 1998, and you might disagree that that's a legitimate enough reason to kick the cattle off the land, and that's a fair argument. But it isn't necessarily part of a conspiracy. But hold, I've got a lot more. They also explain, look, in July 2013, a federal court finally ordered Bundy to get his cattle off of public land within 45 days or risk having them confiscated by the government and sold to pay off the fees and trespassing fines, reportedly in excess of $1.2 million that he owes. You think, well, wait a minute now, okay, now here's the solar company coming in, and all of a sudden in 2013, and there they go. They order him to get the cattle off the land, and then in 2014, finally they take action. As Bundy did not comply with the court order, the confiscation of his cattle began in April 2014, precipitating a tense standoff between Bundy's supporters and law enforcement officials. So April of 2014. Now that's very important. Obviously, that's the month we're in today. Now, Snopes then looked into it to see, well, is there a connection between the solar energy deal and the federal government action against Mr. Bundy? Let me quote. However, the theory that Reed's putative involvement in the Bundy dispute was motivated by a desire to somehow profit from the building of a solar plant falls flat in the face of two basic facts. The site that ENN Mojave Energy was planning to buy in order to build a solar plant is nowhere near the public land Bundy has been disputing with the government. And ENN gave up the solar project and terminated its agreement to buy the land to house it as far back as June 2013. That would be a oops. So, look, I don't put politicians above a trick like this at all. But in this case, even if you go back to when the court finally ordered the cattle off the land, that was in July 2013. That company, the ENN company, it's called Mojave Energy, but it's linked to China, decided not to do that project and publicly announced it in June of 2013. So by the time they take the cattle away in April of 2014, that project is long dead and gone. So it's just not at all related. Besides which, just because you're in the same state and in the general vicinity doesn't mean it's the same land. And it turns out it wasn't. That solar project was never intended for the land that Mr. Bundy had his cattle on. And by the way, in that video explaining how this was a conspiracy against Cliven Bundy, what no one ever explained is, hey, what right does Cliven Bundy have to graze on the land that isn't his? They all say it as if it's his ranch, but it's not. It's federal government property. Now, see, that's a little bit more of a complicated issue. And here's the twist where it turns out that you might have more sympathy for him. But before you get to that sympathy, he's going to try to take it away by being an ass. Okay, he says, when asked about Harry Reid's response to this, he says, I don't have a response for Harry Reid, but I have a response for every county sheriff across the United States. Disarm the federal bureaucrats. Okay, now this is where he loses me entirely. No, we can't have local sheriffs fighting federal government officials and have basically a civil war where everybody draws their weapons. The farmers show up with the weapons, and then you've got the local government, and then you got the local militia, and then you got the federal government, and everybody's got guns. That's a disastrous idea. All so that Mr. Cliven Bundy can get free grazing on federal land. No, I'm not in favor of that. In fact, the other guy not in favor of that is Harry Reid. When they said, hey, look, it looks like the Bureau of Land Management gave up here and gave his cattle back to him, even though he's not paying the fees, Harry Reid said this.
Well, it's not over. We can't have in America people that violate the law and just walk away from it. So it's not over.
Look at that badass with the sunglasses. Okay, oh, all right, Harry. So we'll see how that develops. And the Bureau of Land Management says, look, we've got a lot of remedies we're ready to pursue. In fact, the last one is fairly devastating, and I'll explain that to you at the end as well. So now, what is his claim on this land? I mean, it's not his, it's the federal government, it's ours. By the way, Cliven Bundy owes that $1.2 million to you and me, to the American taxpayer, right? And 16,000 other farmers do pay it, and that's very important. But James McCarthy, professor of political geography at Clark, explains, when our federal land system was set up, it was completely understood and accepted and part of the design that the private landowners would have really extensive access to and use of public lands. So that's really interesting. So it turns out that Cliven Bundy's argument was right in the past. So in the 1880s, when his family first went there, the federal government said, yes, come over here. You don't have to own the federal land. The government will own it. You don't have property rights to it, but we will allow grazing on the land for free. Now, that was in the 1880s and for a long time in the 20th century as well. Things changed, as I'm about to explain. But Jonathan Emmert, an attorney specializing in disputes over federal land, does say there's a long history of federal allowance of trespass. Now, it is trespassing, but the federal government has allowed it in the past. They go on to explain at the Hill, the land management also was put in place in order to encourage settlers to move to remote areas and use it for purposes like ranching, logging, and gold exploration. So this was part of the government program and done on purpose. And oftentimes people relied on it to go out there and saying, hey, you know what, I have this that I can use, a government program that's going to help me, and that's why I'm moving there. So that's a very fair argument. They go on to explain, but in the latter half of the 20th century, as the country became more aware of its effects on the environment, the government's priorities moved away from providing economic benefits through its land and more toward conservation. Now, here's the interesting part where you say, all right, look, his family relied on that to go out there. They built their farm, which is actually a very small farm, and then they used much larger federal land for grazing of their cattle. And at some point, the government said, okay, look, we're changing the rules, and from now on, we have different priorities. Are they allowed to do that? So that's a great question. And in fact, Emmert says that he thinks that it might be a taking. Here, let me explain. Emmert said restrictions on land use, such as grazing fees, sprung up in the 1990s. Since those restrictions devalue people's livelihoods and businesses, they amount to a taking of property. Now, here's the problem. The courts did not agree. They went to court. And that's how we resolve things in a democracy and in this country. So Clive and Bundy's attorneys made this argument and said, hey, listen, you can't change the rules on us. And the federal government made the argument of, look, this is our land. They got to use it for free for decade upon decade. But we have the right, it is our property, to say, hey, these are the new rules on this land, and we're not going to allow for free grazing anymore. And in fact, since the 1990s, all these other farmers have been paying the grazing fees because it's not their land. And the court decided that Bundy was wrong and the government was right, that they could change that rule. Whether it was an official rule, an unspoken rule, it doesn't really quite matter. They had the right as the landowners to charge a fee that everyone else is paying except Bundy, right? So it has been decided. But Bundy decided, I don't care what the courts say, I don't care what the federal government says, I'm going to grab a gun. And I'm going to show up with a lot of friends with guns, and we're going to want our cattle back. Well, that's how we used to do things in the Wild Wild West. That's why people would keep getting shot over and over. And by the way, people keep getting shot over and over today because everybody keeps grabbing their guns. It's a bad idea. So is the government really going to let it go? Well, doesn't appear so. That same expert on land use and the federal government's rights on land use said, quote, they won't let it go and they'll press charges against him in federal court, and they'll try to basically bleed his ability to defend himself and beat him up on technical grounds. They'll put him in a situation where he'll end up with a determination of liability that would be so great that he would have to sell his ranch to them to extinguish his debt. So, Mr. Bundy thinks he's a tough guy, but the federal government's a hell of a thing to mess with. And look, when they use that kind of power unjustly, there's nothing that makes me angry because they're supposed to be our government. But in this case, that federal land is our collective property, okay? It is, that's what it is. And the courts have said it is. So we already adjudicated this. This is not a matter of injustice. This is a matter of one farmer saying, even though everybody else pays the fees, I'm not going to. And the way I'm not going to is by threatening violence against, by the way, innocent government workers there on the scene, okay? And to say, hey, look, we've got our guns and maybe we'll use them. And that was the reason cited by the Bureau of Land Management to give us cattle back because they were concerned about the safety of their workers there. Now, that's not how we're supposed to do things in this country. We're not supposed to resort to violence like that or threats of violence. So, yes, it's a complicated issue. It's an interesting issue, and it's more nuanced than either side gives it credit for. But that being said, in the end, it's not his land. Everybody else pays that fee. He doesn't want to. And he doesn't get to unilaterally decide, and he certainly doesn't get to decide at the point of a gun.